Good morning, friends. I'm Mike Troutman, retired Presbyterian pastor who lives in the greater St. Louis area. And I'm joined by two of my colleagues, the Reverend Jennifer Long and Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Corning, New York, and the Reverend Dr. Steve Langford, who resides in Arlington, Texas. And we're here today on this video to look at Matthew's rendering of Jesus' words on the Mount, the Beattitudes.
So our reading is found in Matthew chapter 5. I'll begin at verse 1. We'll read down through verse 20 from the New Revised Standard Translation. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Here ends our reading. So again, one of the things I'm finding I appreciate about how the narrative lectionary does things is I don't usually attach the 13 to 20 to the Beatitudes. And I think it offers a broader scape to talk about them, which I think is interesting. And I almost never hear, I don't know that I ever remember, maybe it's not that I haven't heard it, but haven't concentrated on, not one stroke, not one letter will pass from the law. I just think those are useful texts.
Those verses reflect the background of the original audience. They were Jewish Christians after the fall of the temple in 70. They're being pressured by the Pharisaic Jews to abandon being the disciples of Jesus to become the disciples of Moses. The Pharisees interpreted the destruction of Jerusalem the way their forefathers had interpreted the destruction of Jerusalem in 587. They viewed it as God's judgment for failing to keep the law, and so they were pressuring people to do a better job of keeping the law. And here Jesus is saying, yeah, I'm going to keep the law. I'm going to do more than that. I'm going to fulfill it. And I'm going to teach you how to fulfill it.
Yeah,
And then
I was just gonna wonder
sorry.
how many different places Jesus talks about fulfilling the law. Um, and
And then he
different
goes
gospels, because this gets heard more than once.
then he goes on and gives 6 examples of how to fulfill the law by living the intent of the law beyond the letter of the law. It's more than behavior, it's the attitude and the spirit.
I also really, for me, think it's really useful for the Beatitudes to be followed by, I mean, I was thinking, how do the Beatitudes prepare me for a life that reflects, or a life that is, how do I live salt? Do the Beatitudes get me ready to live a life as salt? Do the Beatitudes get me ready to live a life as light? And how do I operationalize that? How do I make that real in the life that I lead? I mean, it's a very pretty metaphor. How do I live as salt? But if I don't do anything with it except ask the question, I don't think it's useful.
Well, again, the Beatitudes reflect the background. Moses emphasized the law, particularly the 10 commandments. And here Jesus says, rather than commandments, we live out of attitudes. The inner spirit is what determines the followers of Christ, not the obedience of behavior to law. That's a pretty big shift.
And I'm struck by the metaphor of salt for the 2 ways it can be used. One, for a very positive way, enriching life, and another way, destruction of life. I mean, when the Romans finally defeated Carthage after the third Carthaginian Roman law, they salted the area of Carthage so that nothing would grow there. And I'm struck by, for the first time, maybe it's because of the time we live in, that there is a good sense of faith or religion, and there's a sense in which religion can be toxic and destructive. And I've never heard that, and I think maybe just because we live in the time we do, that I'm much more aware how what our faith is about as Christians is seen by many outside the circle, the shrinking circle of what it means to be a follower of Jesus or a Christian, that they see the ways of faith to be toxic. And I'm just struck by that.
And the toxicity relates directly to this, because generally the toxicity is rooted in rigid thinking that emphasizes proper behavior and does not even consider the spirit, the attitudes of the heart.
Yeah.
And so it becomes. Go ahead, Jen.
No, you finish, Steve. Mine was something different.
The rigidity focusing upon proper behavior blinds us to ourselves and to the inner spirit, the inner attitude. And Jesus is saying that the key in being salt is the attitudes and spirit out of which you live.
I was thinking about the idea that he talks about if salt has lost its flavor, that you can't use it. But I was also thinking about how salt is not only used to flavor, but sometimes salt in a wound is a way to take it somebody. So it wasn't quite the level of destruction you were describing, Mike, but that was it. I really want to compare this. I think it's in Matthew, but I could be wrong, that it is where Jesus sets a child in the midst of them and says, "It is to such as these as belongs the kingdom of heaven." And here he's talking about entering into the kingdom of heaven. And then there will be the camel. You can't get in any better than a camel can get through. You can't get into the kingdom. A rich man cannot get into the kingdom of heaven any better than a camel through the eye of a needle. So I'd love to kind of lay out all those kingdom of heaven references. But but this idea that you will be called great in the kingdom of heaven or never enter, I thought that was an interesting dichotomy. I hear that mostly as Jesus hyperbole, kind of trying to get people to see the difference between living with a particular attitude versus living in a way that only looks at that letter of the law and that maybe gets in the way of being able to embrace those attitudes. But that's just one of the ways I was playing with it in my head.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That verse that talked about, those who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called not out of the kingdom, but least in the kingdom. And that just struck me. I don't know why. It's just like, oh, that's something I've never picked up on, that, that they will be least. They're not out of the kingdom, but they're least in the kingdom, which is it's an interesting metaphor for me. I saw this little thing on a show that I was watching that had a quote of Samuel Beckett that said, "Try again, fail better."
Oh,
And
I like that.
And I like that. I mean, that's just, it hits me of the difficulty of life in the kingdom, that it's not easy, but we usually make it like you're either in or you're out. And when I hear
Our us them thinking makes it an in and an out scenario, and that's not reflected here.
No, I mean, it's just you're the least in the kingdom. Heck, I'd like to be least in the kingdom. That'd be a good place.
But I was just thinking, how easy is it to miss that? I mean, one, there's three of us here going, well, at least two of us have said, I didn't really notice that before. But how easy is it to miss that least is inclusion, as opposed to seeing least as at least as being something that's not good, or hearing least as exclusion when it's not.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, you have two ways. Steve brought in the background of the destruction of the temple, and really what a tragedy that was, both for followers of Jesus and the Jewish community. They were both unimaginable tragedies for both groups. And then those who eventually became the rabbis, the rabbinic tradition that grew out of that tragedy, tried to form a community by behavior in some ways. And the Jesus community tried to form a community out of what you would say, Steve, kind of this attitude of being open to the hurts and pains. Blessed are those, or happy are those, who are in pain and suffer. I think it's really kind of remarkable that both communities out of this tragedy try to form, in the best way they can, what it means to be a follower of Yahweh, or the God we see first revealed in the Hebrew scriptures. It just strikes me how, and then you look later on, you have this growth of Judaism from the Hasidic tradition that is a more joyful attitude one, and you have this shift in the Christian tradition to a more rigid belief-based one, right? It's not easy being a follower. And it should give us some room just to have some space for others.
Well, the phrase "the least in the kingdom" suggests, well, they just need to make some progress. They need to learn and grow. And it is difficult. And how do we overcome it? It's like you said, fail, try, then fail, then try again and fail better.
Yeah.
That's progress. Keep learning, keep growing.
One of the other things I've been playing with in the Beatitudes themselves is I think sometimes they're seen as a dichotomy. You know, there are the ones that are your tough times, you're poor, you're mourning, you're meek, you're hungry. The ones that are like, I don't know, you're not so hard times, you're merciful, you're pure in heart, you're the peacemakers. And then the last two are persecuted and reviled. And I tried to think of the ways that that one can know God in times of need, in times of grief, in times of, I don't know how I would put meek, but in times of hunger, how one can know, and that's like at all times when I need something else, either from others or I might imagine from God. When one is merciful, pure in heart, acting as peacemaker, that those would be times I'm kind of giving to others. But this idea of persecute and being reviled always gets really stuck for me. But one of the things that I really noticed this time was that being persecuted or reviled, or on the flip side, if I'm persecuting or reviling someone else, that's all about judgment. That's all about deciding you're a certain way that needs to be corrected.
Right. Yeah.
And how does that inform me about how I live my own life and how I view others, as opposed to trying to label them? I don't know if that makes sense, but in my own head it does.
What it says to me, the way I deal with those sections you divided, Jen, or the first are about internal attitudes about my spiritual condition that is manifested then in being merciful and pure in heart and a peacemaker. But when I live with mercy and as a peacemaker, I'm out of step with the world, and the world will push back, because the world doesn't want mercy. The world wants get what you deserve. They want judgment. And the world doesn't want peace. They want winning. And so when we try to live differently, we'll be out of step, which is what it means to be in the kingdom, if I'm not mistaken.
I think for me, a revolution in the way I thought about the Beatitudes was due to a trip I took to Central America in '85. For those of you who are younger, that was the time of Reagan and the war in Central America against what was happening in Nicaragua and other reformist movements throughout Central America. And we went to both Nicaragua and Costa Rica. What was really interesting to me, and I'll try to make this really short, is that you had a bunch of 30 Presbyterians who came. I mean, the spectrum of middle-class Presbyterians. And the funny thing is, when we came to Central America and met with many of the base communities and Christian communities there, they had a joy that was just seemingly unknown to us, that a spirit of what you would say blessedness or happiness in the midst of the poverty, in the midst of the war that was happening among them. And for many of us who were there, we were all depressed. and I think we were depressed because for the first time for some of us, and maybe all of us in some ways, we became aware of the poverty of our faith, how much it was tied to our experience of well-being in this world, and how those communities, in many ways, at least among the people we met, who shared meals with us that they really couldn't afford to share, but did and fed us, they had a joy and a sense of blessedness that frankly disarmed us and made us many of us got sick when we got back from that trip, I think because we were disjointed by it and we couldn't feel our way back. It took us a while to get reoriented. And I would say, unfortunately, we became, aware of that, but it soon passed when we got back in the land of plenty for us. So, I forever these words have been altered by that trip in '85. So, long story, but
It's-
I hope it makes a little sense to people.
It strikes me, Mike, when I hear people today talk about being blessed, it is because of their material position of what they have or what they get to enjoy. And in the Beatitudes, there's nothing, the blessedness is not tied to material things at all.
No, it's to that spirit you talked about,
Yeah.
to that sense of there's something more in this world. To a sense of feeling that, life is not fair. I don't like the dichotomy, the world and us. I think I like more the dichotomy between, a way of living life that is open and giving and transformational, and a way of life that's stuck in the paradigms of power, and revenge and violence. So I think both people in the religious field and both people in the secular field can swap places sometimes. So I think that attitude flows. I mean, I think of Paul's kind of universal that, hey, all of us have been exposed to the love of God. How are we going to respond to it? Even if we may not call it the love of God. I guess that's what I'm saying.
And believe it or not, on that note,
Oh, that's too bad for us.
we have reached our 20-minute mark, and I think Steve is going to pray us out.
Yep.
All right. Thanks for conversation. Let's pray together. And so merciful and gracious God, God of the kingdom, thank you that you've called us to live the ways of the kingdom, to be a part of the kingdom. Help us to continue to grow in our understanding of the kingdom ways, that we might indeed live them in the world. Nurture within us the attitudes that will make us merciful and peaceful, is our prayer in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Peace, friends.
Peace.
Peace of Christ.